Welcome into Inside Carolina, a special edition of Inside Carolina podcast. I'm Tommy Ashley. We're sponsored by Johnny T-shirt and Congruity. You recognize Grace Nugent there on the right, Pat James of D1 Baseball in the middle. We're going to talk a little North Carolina Diamond Hills baseball. 2025 season is just 2 days away, weather permitting. Good gracious. You know, if they'd played this game last week, we'd have been in shorts. Now they're potentially going to play in cold, wet, damp weather, but such as college baseball in February. Pat, I'm going to get right into it. People that watch this and religiously follow Carolina baseball know your credentials, know everything about D1 and the work y'all do. Sixth in the preseason? Seems maybe a little high. We talked about it at the first pitch dinner. But what have you seen overall that warrants this kind of preseason hype for this Tar Heel team that obviously made Omaha last year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, really, a lot of it boils down to the pitching staff. Obviously, we'll get into the offense a little bit more here soon, I'm sure. But the amount of innings coming back, I mean, sure, you lose a Dalton Pence. That's going to be one of the more interesting guys to watch. I mean, obviously, a lot of guys lost from last year, seemed some key figures. I think that's the one who, for me, outside the obvious one, who needs to go unnamed, I suppose. That's the one who I'm really intrigued. How do you replace it? But you do have the depth to do so. Obviously, you know, look in the bullpen, Matthew Mateus, number 3 in D1 Baseball's recent reliever power rankings that came out. Obviously, a very justified ranking for him, was just absolute nails all of last year. And you combine that, you know, with, you know, obviously a Jason DeCaro, you know, what's in store for him as a sophomore, Folger Boaz coming back, Jake Knapp coming back. I think there's just a lot of intriguing options for this pitching staff. And I mean, really what's going to be fascinating to see is how that stands out with the rest of the ACC, where, I mean, honestly, you can go down a long line of teams where the pitching staff is where it really stands out to me the most. So I think that's definitely the biggest reason for that ranking. Obviously, there's some things to figure out on the offensive end, but there's still a lot of upside there as well.
When you look at Dalton Pence, Grace, I mean, this guy it felt like watching last year that he was in the middle of every big situation North Carolina had on the mound, especially late. I mean, look at the NCAA tournament. It was just electric, and you had a guy like Pence doing it. It's not that simple to replace, to Pat's point, Grace, but we talked a little bit about maybe Jake Knapp can do that. Maybe Mateus can be a closer. I don't know if they'll use him that way. But your thoughts here to replace Pence? Not replace Pence. Have somebody in the Pence role, maybe. Let's put it that way.
I think one of the great things about what Dalton did, and Forbes talks about it so many times, is that he called him a horse, and you could bring him in any situation. He was kind of your get out of jail free card. And I think his age and his experience really helped with that, and just the type of pitcher he is. And so I don't see that as much as Maddie. I see that more if they want to go that route, which Forbes has talked about a lot more than I think most people expected, is that you could put Jake in that role. And you can have him with a fastball that gets up to 96, 97 miles per hour. And you have the high velocity and more of the control and just this older mentality. And I could see that happening. And then they kind of leave Maddie where he is, where he can go anywhere from 1 to 3 innings when things are getting bad. And then for that closer role to really nail it down and have those, you know, Jared Jones at bats, you put in someone like Jake that's a little bit older, which is not a knock on Maddie or any of the other experienced guys in that bullpen. I just think Jake could fit that role really well. But he could also maybe, if Aiden Houck gets his walks under control, he could maybe look for him to go in a role similar to that as well. And then they have Cale Bolton and Dylan Weber and Tom Chmielewski, who are all older, and we haven't really seen play at this D1 level that the ACC bats are going to bring, that he could slot in other places who have that experience.
I think a key point of this is Forbes always talks about low heartbeat guys. And you need some. I felt like Pence would be jacked up, but he was calm and he could bring it. We talked about Jake Knapp and Pat, when you go from being a starter to a closer, that's a big mental difference there. I don't care how much you practice it or do it during the fall or whatever you're doing, and you couple coming off an injury. It's not just as simple as saying I'm going to be a starter 1 year, be hurt, miss an entire season. Now I'm going to be the closer. So that mindset shift. Just talk about that a little bit. What you've seen across covering college baseball.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely varies for some. I mean, like you can definitely see those guys who, I mean, it's a clear stereotype. You mentioned that like slow heartbeat. I mean, I think, when we're talking about that sort of attribute, I think that that's probably the thing that Matthew Mateus brings the most. I mean, Coach Forbes talked about that specifically at the press conference a couple of weeks ago, but I mean, that's just kind of who he is, Matthew Mateus. And I think that Jake Knapp does have that to a certain degree as well. You go back to 2 years ago, and I think he had maybe 1 or 2 appearances out of the bullpen in his healthy season. And I think that, it will be interesting to see just kind of like how that works for him in terms of his recovery. I know when we talked to Coach Forbes 2 weeks ago that, he was around the 25 pitch mark or so. Obviously, continuing to build up from there. I don't really know exactly like at what point you can start having him go out there and have maybe some of those sort of elongated outings that we got used to seeing with Matthew Mateus and Dalton Pence last year. I think that's what's really intriguing about both those guys from last year is that, in my head, I think that Dalton was out there for maybe longer stretches of time overall. But you look over right now, 58 2/3 innings for Dalton Pence last year, 58 for Mateus. And you also had, I think, the same number of appearances as well. Yeah, at 36 each. So obviously, a big hole to fill, but obviously I think it's kind of a pretty easy transition for Matty to be able to make in that role. And then obviously, how do you fill in those spots around it? I think where I'm really intrigued to see how that develops is with, some of these young arms who are coming in, who looked, going back to the fall, like really special.
Yeah, Grace, get in. I think, that middle relief has become so important, especially in baseball in general. But in college baseball, we've seen Carolina need middle relief in the first or second inning, even from, a guy like DeCaro. So, Grace, Pat mentioned the young arms. Just sort of rattle some out here that could step into that role to take over those innings lost. Because like you said, Pat, if you move Mateus to the closer, then you've got to fill that 50-some innings there in the middle. And Aiden Houck did a fair amount of that earlier in the year. But enlighten us about the young arms, because there's a lot of them on this team.
They have a lot. And I remember Pat and I were watching one of the like fall World Series, or might have been one of the like scrimmages that they did. And the ones that really popped out to us were Walker McDuffie and Ryan Lynch. And I remember we're sitting there and Ryan Lynch comes up and you're like, oh, it's a freshman, whatever. And he just like dazzling. I don't know if it was his curveball or McDuffie's curveball, but one of them has just like this nasty curveball. It's awesome to watch. And then Cameron Seagraves, I sat outside the outfield fence on Sunday when they're doing their last, I think, like prep weekend a few days ago to like, get homework done. It was really pretty out. And Seagraves pitched, and they had McDuffie pitch and they had Lynch pitch. And so I think it's those three that would really make a difference. But I think the biggest thing that you have when you have young arms is, do they have the command? Because if you make one mistake pitch, the ball is gone. Olin Johnson pitched, I think, 3 or 4 innings in their like little scrimmage. And I mean, he did great, but he had one mistake pitch. And I think Parker McCoy, one of the freshmen, sent it over the scoreboard. So the whole question is, are they going to be able, not a knock on Olin at all, I think he'll come up later in the pitching conversation, but are these freshmen going to be able to go in those middle relief situations when the score is tied, when it's really close, and be able to deliver and not walk a lot of people? Because that's what happened last year with some of those freshmen. I mean, even Jason and Folger had a little bit of a problem with that. And then you have guys like Boston Flannery and Olin Johnson at the beginning of last season who didn't really break out more because the problem was the walks. And even Aiden, that was the thing that kind of hindered him, was the walks. He was able to get out of it with like a Houdini-like ability most of the time. But that's the only problem I see with these young arms. But if they can harness that and get that command under control, I think these guys can be special, and it can be super unexpected because everyone has heard of the Boaz is coming back and Jake Knapp is coming back, and you have Cam Paget and Kyle Percival and Olin Johnson, all people who have pitched before or they've been talked about a ton. And I think there's these like 3 kind of dark horse freshmen who could make a run for something really special. And that's what they need because starters don't go 7 innings anymore. I mean, if you get them to 4 or 5, you're happy. So it'll be really, really interesting to see who jumps up in that middle relief spot.
And Pat, Scott Forbes has shown absolutely he'll pitch the young guys. I mean, we've seen it. The guy we've got to talk about, Jason DeCaro. It's like the Cooper Flag effect. Jason DeCaro is only 17 years old.
Right.
But Forbes will play young pitchers or will throw young pitchers if they deserve to be out there, and he'll give them the opportunity to tell him whether or not they can handle it, especially early in the season. Let's talk about the starting rotation here and where some of those young guys might slide in. DeCaro, I think, is the Friday guy. Unless something's changed drastically, I think he's Friday. But you've got Boaz back, who's virtually he's not a freshman, and he's an older guy, but he didn't pitch a ton last year. Who's left and who can get into this rotation not named Olin Johnson or Cam Paget? The young guys seem poised to, take their spot, and Forbes is fine with it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you might initially see, those 3 names that Grace mentioned, primarily working out the pen to start. I think you're right. They're going to throw them out there immediately. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if you see all 3 of them pitch this weekend, as long as, nothing else has come up, injury-wise. I know Walker McDuffie had a little bit of a arm injury that was kind of, bothersome this fall. He was able to pitch through it. Don't know if that's progressed anymore at all, but I think that when you look at the rest of the rotation, I know, Grace, that you saw Olin Johnson in the summer. I'll let you kind of talk about him more. He's the guy who I think is really kind of the X factor for me in terms of, who that third spot in the rotation is. Obviously, the big name that, coming out of the fall was Kyle Percival and the strides that he's made. Velocity ticking up a little bit, showing, a little bit more improved secondary stuff. A guy who obviously is, accumulated a decent amount of innings over his first 2 years. How much of an uptick are we going to see from him in terms of his usage? I don't know. I mean, like, there's definitely, like, in the fall, it certainly was impressive. I feel like if I'm putting the pitching staff together, I think in an ideal world, I feel more comfortable with him in the bullpen, having that lefty option. It could potentially be a little bit more of a shutdown option out of the bullpen. And then I would guess, obviously the rotation hasn't been announced at this point, but I'm going to think that Aiden Hawk is going to be the guy who gets that first crack at it this weekend at Texas Tech. He probably has the most experience of these guys we're talking about, disincluding Jake Knapp. So I don't think we're going to see him in the rotation right away. So I think that's the guy who, like, is really interesting. Obviously had a chance to go pro, turn down the opportunity to sign with the Twins. I think bringing him back, no matter what his role ends up being, I think just having just another guy who, logged a large sum of innings for you last year is going to go a long way for this pitching staff. One of the guys who we haven't talked about in terms of departures is Shea Sprague, notching 70+ innings last year. Obviously, kind of had his ups and downs, but, down the second half of the season, was extremely consistent for this ball club. And, just the experience that he brought to the table. So certainly I think that there's a few options there, but if I were going to have to put any money on it, I would say Aiden Hawk is probably going to get that first crack.
Grace, talk about what you saw from Olin in the summer, but also, when you look, they've got a ton of right-handed arms. They don't have a ton of lefties. You mentioned Chewy, Percival, Boaz, Dylan Weber is on it as well. Forbes has talked about Percival a lot, and I agree that having that option out of the pen, that's another thing we didn't talk about with Pence. That's a lefty, a power lefty out of the pen. I'm not sure Carolina can do that at this point this season, but round out the pitching discussion here. Shea Sprague, great call out, because that's a guy who I think most people have forgotten how good he was down the stretch for Carolina. I mean, I stood with his parents during one of the regionals back on the thing, and they, bless them, they live and die with every pitch out there. I don't see how they were able to do it, but was interesting to watch how they were reacting to their son, who seemed overly calm pitching. It's fascinating how that works. But close out the pitching rotation for North Carolina, Grace.
Well, talking about Shea, you don't get to Omaha if you don't have Shea. You definitely don't get to Omaha if you don't have Dalton, which I think is a weird dichotomy in this pitching staff because you are returning, I guess, a lot of potential innings that you could have had last year. And Jake is obviously more experienced and older, but at the same time, you're only going to have a few pitchers who have, like Pat said, that starting experience. Jason DeCaro is one of them. Aiden Houck is another one. And then the ones that had a lot of those big pressure innings like you would have in regionals and in supers and in Omaha are gone. But you also have older guys on the team. So it's just going to be an interesting dichotomy with this pitching staff, especially with Knapp and Boaz coming back. I just think that's going to be interesting to watch because some of the younger guys have more experience than those older arms, which I'm excited. But talking about Olin, I saw Olin this summer. He actually, I think they just sent out the Cape Cod Championship rings, and he won with the Harwich Mariners. So he will have a ring at home in Washington. I think it got delivered to his parents. But one of the things that really stood out for me is they gave him, I mean, the way the Cape works is the championship series is a best of 3, and they gave him, he started the first game, and it was an away game. They played at the Bournes Park, and he was really good playing there, and I think that's one of the reasons they started him. But they also started him because he really had increased his mental ability on the mound. And I talked to him after one of his games, and he said the thing that he was most excited about is that he didn't let the walks get to him. If he let up a hit, he didn't let it snowball, and his velocity also ticked up. Now, take that with a grain of salt for me because some of those radar guns are just so incorrect up there. But from reputable sources, his velocity is ticked up. But a lot of it, I think, is just mental. If he gets out of his head and just calms down on the mound, I think, like Pat said, he could be a huge X factor. I mean, he's 6'6", he's long, he's lanky. It's not like a super really taxing delivery on his arm. But if he gets out of his head and he's able to, if he walks a guy, okay, move on. To take a quote from Ted Lasso, if he's a goldfish and he's able to forget what he messes up, I think that he will be great. I think that his biggest problem is all up here. And if they can get that kind of over and done with, I think he can be a huge part. And they tried to do that last year. And I know in between whatever his first game was, maybe it was Wagner and ECU, he was sick that whole week and lost 10 pounds, which is super unhelpful if you're about to pitch against ECU. And I think if he gets all of those factors together, which I think he can break into that weekend starting rotation and he can be really, really good for them. And so, I mean, but it's just all up to how he performs on the mound. I think that the first few weeks for him are going to be really important, and it's going to tell us a lot about how Forbes wants to structure this pitching staff.
One more question about the pitching staff, and when I'm listening to Grace and the mental aspect, I'm thinking of Yogi Berra's comment or quote about what baseball is. But Pat, overcoming an injury, Jake Knapp, obviously, that was devastating for him. Folger Boaz dealt with it, a couple different surgeries, but still an injury to your moneymaker, for lack of a better way of putting it, to your throwing arm. How big is that? I mean, it's gotten less of a thing as time has progressed because the surgery is so fantastic these days and so many people have it. But what side mental or how much is a mental factor there for these guys, whether it's Knapp or Boaz coming back and sort of figuring it out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the bigger part of it. Like you said, I mean, the number of guys who return, not only just return now, but return and sometimes even look better. That percentage is drastically improving, it seems like, every single year. And so I think that it really does come down to a lot of that. And I think, obviously, we got our glimpses of Folger last year, but when he came in his freshman fall, I mean, that's what stood out as much as anything, was just the maturity and the composure. I mean, those are two words I feel like that we're kind of throwing around a lot here with a lot of these guys who we're talking about. But I mean, it was extremely apparent, just his demeanor on the mound. I think you combine that, obviously Jake as well. Jake's been around the block. I mean, Jake's had a lot of adversity in his. We saw him talk at the first pitch banquet where, I mean, going back to, being at UNC Wilmington, not having much success there, then on to Walter State, coming here. It's been a bit of a journey for him. And so I think that, bringing him back into the fold, I think this is a guy who feels like he has a lot to prove. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I was thinking about it a few weeks ago where, you go back to this time last year when he was out there in preseason. I mean, that was a guy who, in my opinion, on my looks, looked like a top 30, top 40 starting pitcher in the country at the very least. And so obviously, it's a lot to ask for him to come back and be that immediately, but it's in there, it's in the tank. And I do think it does help for a certain degree where, you've had Dalton Pence and Max Carlson who have undergone these bracing procedures in the past. Something this program's familiar with, Terry Joe Rosinski, the athletic trainer, obviously a major resource for this. So I think that's something that's going to be big. I do want to say before we close the pitching staff conversation, one more guy who we've kind of hovered around, but who I don't know what it is, but when I've been thinking about this pitching staff recently, the guy who I keep coming back to could be maybe the biggest X factor is Cam Padgett, in my opinion.
Yep.
A guy who has thrown, I think, around 70 innings so far in his 2 years at UNC, has shown some real flashes at times. I mean, I remember his first outing as a freshman, I think in a midweek start, got the win in that one, looked really sharp. I think even you go back to last year in Omaha, his outing there in that mop-up duty kind of against Tennessee, I mean, I think Grace and I even talked about that a little bit. I think that was one of his best outings of the season last year. I think, again, that's one where kind of that headspace comes into play a little bit, but I think the stuff is there. The fastball velo is reportedly ticked up a little bit. I know looking over some of the metrics this summer, even though he didn't have a ton of success on the Cape, he was getting a good amount of swing and miss with that pitch. And if you can get that along with, some ever improving secondaries, I mean, you go back to his freshman year, Coach Forbes said that Cam Padgett's changeup was as good as he'd seen since Mike Marin. And so, that's about 14 years ago or so now. Gosh, it's hard to keep track of that time, but,
really.
I think that he could be a huge part of this, especially as we're talking about kind of these bullpen innings and kind of where they've come from.
Yeah, there's a lot of innings to eat up. A lot of guys will do it. We didn't talk about Jason DeCaro a ton, but obviously his record and his abilities speak for themselves. And Grace, if he's better than he was last year, which he's going to be, he could be better and not have the same amount of success. But DeCaro is a guy that can be the face of the program here for North Carolina on the mound on Fridays. I'll let you talk about him since we didn't really talk about him, because I think his story is great. It's almost like a movie type story, but he's got the opportunity to really set himself apart as far as some of the greats at Carolina. And that's big shoes to fill, but I think he's good enough to do that.
I think he is, and I think he's the right person to do it too. He's a little bit laid back when you talk to him. He's not overtly flashy or anything like that. And Forbes has talked a lot about it. I talked to him about it, that he's really trying to increase that leadership skill. Because, I mean, he came into college at 17, and if he was listening, he would really want me to be like, Grace, you need to stop talking about my age, because he and I talked about that. Everyone talked about his age, and he's kind of done with that. He's like, I'm old enough. I've had a season. Just let me pitch. Let me lead the pitching staff. And I think he's going to do an even better job. He has 4 real, true pitches. And I think just having more time with them, more time with Coach Gaines, more time with Coach Howell, more time in the pitching lab, just more comfortability with himself and everything that he has, more confidence. I think that's just going to be amazing for him. And I think he can be a true leader of this staff. and a great face on the mound. I don't think he gets too flustered by the big situations. And he'll tell you, he was like, the regional and the super, he doesn't think are his best outings. He's got a lot more in the tank. And he has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder to want to prove that to people. And if you have Jason leading this pitching staff, and I've said this, and I'm pretty sure Pat has said something similar, I think this can be one of the most well-rounded and deep staffs in the ACC and in the country in general. If they're playing up to their highest potential, if you have Jason firing on all cylinders, wherever you put in Jake, whoever's in those middle innings, those midweek starts, Forbes talked about having Cam come out of the bullpen. If you have an arm like Cam Padgett who's come out of the bullpen, that's going to be really hard to do anything against. And so I think with Jason leading this pitching staff, and I think Forbes has talked about it, it's that second-year jump in the program. I mean, they could all come up aces. They have the potential to do that.
Indeed, that is the Carolina pitching staff. We got a lot more to talk about with Pat James and Grace Nugent. Folks, while we talk about Carolina baseball, must talk about Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Great sponsors of this podcast, great friends of Inside Carolina, and a great place for you to get all your Carolina swag. It's baseball season. We're talking baseball. Go to Johnny T-Shirt on East Franklin Street. Get all the swag you need. They've got the jerseys, the hats, T-shirts. If you want a journalism school shirt, you can go to Johnny T-Shirt. If you want something for tailgating, you can go to Johnny T-Shirt. If you want stickers, Christmas ornaments, anything you could possibly need Carolina related, Johnny T-Shirt's got you covered. And if you can't get the East Franklin Street, then get them online at JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Great friends, great Inside Carolina sponsor, and also a great way to get 10% off your order. If you go get the Inside Carolina Premium Board code, take it with you to Johnny T-Shirt or enter it in on JohnnyT-Shirt.com. It's 10% off your order. Also, another great sponsor is on the top of the screen. That way, I guess, Congruity. Email Matt at congruityhr.com. Get your free assessment. Get your small business rolling with Matt and Darren and that crew at Congruity. They made themselves a national brand. They can make you a national brand. You start local, you go big. You expand your footprint. Congruity. Matt at congruityhr.com. Tell them Inside Carolina sent you. That's also free. Now back to the show. Let's talk about who these guys will be throwing to, because I think we talk a lot about leadership, and we've seen on the basketball court, guys don't talk. There's not a ton of player-led leadership. Pat, I don't think there's going to be a problem with player-led leadership with a guy like Luke Stevenson behind the plate.
No, not at all. I mean, we talked, talking about, Folger, talking about DeCaro. Again, another one of those freshmen who last year, I mean, he came in there and just the way that he grabbed hold of that pitching staff is maybe one of the more impressive things that I've seen from a freshman in the fall, in the time that I've spent, around, this program specifically. I think that just the command that he has, I think, Tommy, I think it was you who even asked about this at the media day a couple of weeks ago. But, Luke, obviously, sitting out this offseason, just kind of watching this pitching staff and just kind of further enhancing those leadership abilities from the sidelines, quote unquote. I think that could have major dividends for this team going into the spring. And obviously, as we're kind of talking about, bridging these two topics together a little bit, I think the fact that you do have a guy who is such a good receiver, such a good blocker, and obviously has an absolute cannon behind the plate. I think when you have a guy who you trust that much, it can just prop up that pitching staff that much more. And so I think, what he's going to bring to the table for this team is going to be, I mean, this is a guy who obviously, he's preseason third-team All-American by D1 baseball. I think, it's certainly in the realm of possibility for him to be first team when it's all come said and done. Obviously a guy who I believe can be a top 10 pick, as a draft eligible sophomore this year. That's the bummer of all this is that, barring something terrible happening, I mean, this is going to be the last chance that we're going to be able to have to watch him in the college game. And I think that just that polish that he has is going to pay dividends for this team in so many different ways.
A couple parts of that. Not only did he take hold of the pitching staff, they not let him, but they, big word alert, acquiesced to his leadership.
Yeah.
early. I mean, you got a freshman coming in. Granted, he's an older freshman. You mentioned he's draft eligible sophomore, but he comes in with a lot of old guys, Dalton, Pence, and they like, hey man, we're with you, Grace. I think the point about him watching in the fall can't be overstated because the couple things he talked about is, calling pitches is an art for him. And for him to be able to sit beside Coach Gaines and know the why. Why are we doing this here? Why are we doing that now? And all those things. I think that's going to help him more, to me, him being able to do that than if he'd played in the fall. A, he's more rested. He's got, he's healthy. But B, to be able to sit for lack of a better way of putting it, in a coaching stance during the fall and get that experience, I think that is huge for him. Your thoughts on Luke? I mean, we all agree that this guy's good. I mean, and he is probably, or definitely is, in the most important position on the field for Carolina.
I totally agree. And I think some people don't understand how important and how tough a catcher's job is. Because you have to go from catching, like last year, he'd have to go from catching Shea, whose fastball got up to like 90, 91 miles per hour, and he just dotted it up, to catching Dalton, who got up to like 97 miles per hour within the span of maybe about 2 minutes in a game that would decide if they were going to Omaha. And he handled it with complete poise. And back to Pat's point, he is a fantastic catcher. And I think when you look at his like offensive numbers from last season, you're like, okay, 284. How many people on the Tar Heels like lineup were hitting over 300? But he does so much as a catcher. And I mean, he hit some huge hits for the Tar Heels as well. And he has that poise and he has that command and that leadership ability. And to your point, Tommy, him sitting out and watching for the fall, when he and I talked about it, obviously he wanted to be out on the field more than anything, but he said it was a blessing in disguise because he got to sit with Gaines and he got to coach first base, which is big because he's working on becoming a better base runner, which he and Forbes both talked about. And he would say specifically it was the pitch sequencing that he's getting to learn, which obviously he's going to learn if he's catching and he's going to see as the pitches come in. But I think there's something to be said for him sitting by Gaines, getting to ask as many questions as he wants, and learning with all of these new pitchers or guys that he only caught a few times in the fall, i.e. Jake Knapp, about what works best when. Because all he had to focus on in that point sitting next to Gaines is why he's calling what he's calling. And when he's behind the plate, he's more concerned about, okay, do we have a runner on first? Do we have a runner on second? Who's in center field? Who's in the pen? What is he catching? What about if he messes up? Where do I need to put my body? Instead of worrying about all of that, he could literally just hone in on what the pitches do, why the pitch is being called, and what it's going to do to that batter at the plate. And he said he also got to call a few innings. So I think that's really valuable for him. And I just don't really know how to articulate how important Luke is because I just don't think your casual baseball watcher will always get that. Obviously, last year, Vance was so important. So many defensive run saves. He was that electric player. But UNC still has one of those. It just might not be in the most flashy way that Vance was in center field. It's more important, it's more steady, and he's right behind the plate involved in every single pitch.
Indeed. I think we've said enough about Luke Stevenson, but I think, he's the guy that makes this all go. Pat, she brought up the guy we didn't mention to start with, who Carolina's got to replace. Scott Forbes says he's the best defensive center fielder in college baseball, best he's seen. I think we're going to find out how good he is or was for Carolina this year. Even though I think Carolina will be nice in the outfield, it's still not Vance Honeycutt nice. How does Carolina not replace him, but put a player in that position? I guess it's Kane Kepley out there, who is going to be – you're going to go from Vance Honeycutt, who's 6'3", 225, to Kane Kepley, who is a dog but is a smaller dog. He's still got a lot of bark and a lot of bite. How does Carolina replace the outfield? Not just Honeycutt, but D'Onofrio, Casey Cook as well.
Yeah, what a group. We talked about it last year where, that outfield toe-to-toe, is right among the best in all of college baseball last season. So it is a big ask. And like, obviously Vance is the headliner there, but I mean, all three of those guys were really, really good players. And obviously, I mean, as much as we talk about what Vance brought defensively, Casey was quite solid and D'Onofrio was very, very, very solid. And so it is like there are big shoes to fill out there. I do think that the way that they have gone about trying to fill those spots, it's really, for lack of a better word, just a very valiant effort. Because I do think that Kane Kepley is a very good center fielder. Obviously, he's not Vance Honeycutt, but he is a very, very good defensive center fielder. From what I've seen from Tyson Bass, going back to the fall, obviously, some speed there as well between the two of them. I think they'll be able to track down a lot of balls, maybe not some of those every single ball like Vance would. And certainly there will be certain ones there, we might see them exerting themselves a little bit more than some of the, nonchalant plays we saw from Vance out there in center the last couple of years. I think when it comes down defensively in the outfield, I mean, even offensively, it's, left field, Rom Kellis, looking like the lead dog out there. I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen enough at this point to just kind of figure out just what that's going to look like. Obviously put up some pretty good numbers at Florence Darlington Tech. How does that translate? I mean, it seems like based off some of the recaps I've read from the preseason, he's been pretty hot coming out here in January. But how does that translate? And so I'm really fascinated by that. Obviously, as we're talking about all this defensively, I mean, you're right. Like there are certain pieces of it where it is going to be a downgrade defensively. But as I look around like this team, like I really do, I kind of like the defensive potential of it. Like I do think it's quite solid. Obviously we talked about Luke. I think they're just very strong up the middle. Coach Forbes talked about it. Luke at catcher. I like Madera and Vanderbrake up the middle. I mean, Vandy was pretty solid there at second base going back to 2 years ago. I know everybody kind of got lost in kind of, his offensive struggles last year. But he was very capable at that second base bag, and Madera made some really good plays. I remember in the regional against LSU, the first win, I mean, he made some remarkable plays that I think were obviously, I mean, in my opinion, might have been as big as, the home run that Vance Honeycutt hit there in the 8th inning that really kind of helped win that game for them. You also have, Kane Kepley in center, but where I'm really intrigued by are the corners on the infield. Where, you have Gavin Gallagher coming back, he's got an extra year under his belt. Grace and I spoke to him briefly at Media Day. Like, you go back to his, I mean, he played, I think, every position in the fall except for pitcher and catcher. And I mean, it was remarkable how much he moved around. So I think it was around April or so in my eyes when he really started to settle in there at third base. And he really played a good third base down the stretch. And although Parks Harbor improved a lot at first base over the course of last season, Hunter Stokely is a very good first baseman, and he is maybe the best UNC first baseman who I've covered defensively. Coach Forbes has talked about him in the past as a Gold Glove caliber defensive player, not only in terms of what he's able to do, picking balls, laying out and getting some stuff too. He's also a very, very heady player. I can't remember what game it was 2 or 3 years ago where he just made this super heads up play where he was charging in on a bunt and he knew that there was going to be a review, but he still threw home on this one play. I can't remember the full details of it, but it was just like, I mean, that just guy, he knows what's happening and, he's super experienced, I think over 130 games in his career. So I think what you have, maybe you've lost in some of these other spots. Maybe you've kind of, upgraded in some senses and some other ones defensively.
Yeah, I mean, you may lose the quote-unquote superstar, but if everybody else is better, I think it's a great point about Gallagher. And, Grace, you can take it wherever you want to go. But I thought Gallagher against LSU sort of set the bar of what he can do at third. I said all year, until maybe April or May, that Carolina didn't have a difference maker at third base. And a lot of times we'll sit down on that third base line and see teams that have a difference maker at third base. I think against LSU especially, because it was the most televised game and everybody saw Tommy White hitting rockets down there, Gallagher sort of set his bar of I can be this guy at third and make those plays. And Pat, your point about Stokely, I think a lot of people overlook Stoke And I think we have covering it, and obviously not playing last year. But to hear Forbes talk about him that way, it is Forbes sees him every day, and Forbes is super positive. We all know that, but he's not going to put a guy out there that's not going to help the team. And he slotted him there. We'll see how it shakes out. But Grace, defensively, it'll look different. There won't be situations where somebody hits a rocket into the gap and you just start working to the dugout with 2 outs because you know somebody's catching it. But I agree with Pat. It could somehow be better on the whole. We'll see, though. What do you think?
It kind of reminds me of Moneyball. It's like, how can we recreate this in the aggregate? If we just combine everyone together, how can we get this OBP? And Tommy, I know you and I have talked about it. The defensive look it's going to be different. Kane, I got to see Kane this summer as well. He's not Vance. We've said that a lot. I think it's disrespectful to kind of compare the two. They're very different players. And I think I saw him on Sunday make some just fantastic diving plays on center. He's not going to get everything. He's not 6'3". He doesn't have like the speed of an NFL safety or whatever. He's not Vance, but I think he's going to do a great job in center field. He and I talked about how he's learning that outfield. And at Liberty, he was in a lot deeper outfield. And he's kind of learning how to use where our fence is and a little more of a hitter's ballpark that the Bosch is. And then I think the corners are going to be really interesting. Forbes has talked about how Tyson is like a D'Onofrio. I can already see that, both in the way they play, and they're just little quirky personalities. It's always a character in right field. It's super fun. And then I think left field is your big question mark. But I also think that Casey was your worst defender in that outfield. Right. I mean, not at the plate, but he was your worst defender in that outfield, and they made that work. Not that he was bad by any means. I mean, he got drafted to my favorite team, and I'm super excited about it. So, but they're still going to have to work that out. And then, Tommy, you and I have definitely talked about this. I echo all the Gavin stuff. I think that, and Pat, you had told me before last season, you're like, Gavin is going to be the X factor. Gavin is going to be the X factor. And well, against LIU, he legitimately was the X factor. And in that entire regional, Tommy Tanks hit so many like tough hit ground balls to him. Like the exit velocity off those, you could just hear him like doink everywhere. And Gavin got to every single one of them. He really was a dynamic third baseman, and they need that. And I think Stokely is going to be awesome at first. It's going to be great to see him come back. He's had some big hits, at least in the 1 year I got to see him play. I know he had a walk-off after like that 11 p.m. rain delay against Miami, where they had to start the next day, and we were at the Bosch for like 14 hours. That just sticks out to me as a Hunter Stokely time. I think Madera and Vanderbrake are really scrappy in the infield. Forbes is kind of like in Moneyball. He's cherry-picked the guys that I think are overlooked by a lot of people for one thing or another, and he's put them together to make what could be really special. I don't think Hunter Stokely is who many people think of when they think of really dynamic first baseman. And Madera came from a D3, and Vanderbrake came from a JUCO all the way on the opposite coast. And Tyson came from North Carolina Wesleyan. And I think a lot of people have told Kane, you're too short to play center field. You don't have the explosive power. And then Rom, like Jake Knapp, has kind of bounced around. And Gavin's kind of been the one, younger guy that people actually thought, okay, he can be something coming out of high school. So, I mean, obviously, same with Luke. But I think he's done a really good job of kind of picking up these misfits and just kind of getting the best potential out of them. And I think that while it might not be as like headlining and explosive, you're going to have a really solid defense. And I think the places where like Vance obviously struggled striking out, that's one thing Kane Kepley is not really going to do. He can have the reverse numbers of that. He could have like 80 walks and 30 strikeouts instead of whatever Vance's ratio is. And Tyson will have some power. And Rom has showed, at least this preseason, that he has power if he is the one that stays in left field. That could also be Perry Hargett. That could also be Gavin if you needed to. It could be Sam Angelo. That's the bigger, I think, question mark. But I think at the plate and defensively, Scott Forbes and the entire pitching or the entire coaching staff has done a really good job of trying to weave all the gaps together and fill them in different places.
Talking with Pat James and Grace Nugent, previewing Carolina's 2025 season. The lineup will be interesting. I think Kepley leads off. Bass is up there. And Forbes has shown that he likes to go left, right. He says it just works out naturally, but I think it's
works out. Okay, Scott.
It's like third straight year is left, right. It's more than natural. But so Carolina's got plenty of options. Pat, I want to ask you one last question, and then we can wrap it up or keep talking. Scott Jackson joining this staff. Not only did he bring 2 good players, we didn't talk about Matty Dye, and 3 good players, but Scott Jackson brings another wealth of knowledge, a good friend of Scott Forbes. How do you see that working out? I think it's been a boon for him player-wise, but also coaching staff-wise. Your take there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think that this is one of the moves, like a highlight of which, you and I talked a little bit, Tommy, where this offseason you saw some similar moves like this, where you saw some head coaches at D1 schools leaving for assistant jobs. The one that namely comes to mind is I'm blanking on his first name, but Kelly, who was the head coach at Washington, leaves to become the pitching coach at Texas A&M. I think between that and then obviously Coach Jackson coming back here to UNC, I think that's kind of part of the revolution you're seeing where, there's so much going on nowadays, with college baseball in particular. Obviously this applies to so many other sports. I'm just kind of trying to narrow the focus, but with all the moving parts, between trying to put the rosters together and, trying to still coach at the same time. I think just what he brings to the table is going to be really big for this club. Just having that extra voice, a guy who has had experience in multiple different seats. Obviously, I think, it's going to be huge recruiting wise to see kind of how this plays out. We've seen recently where UNC's recruiting is kind of not that ever necessarily, I don't want to say dipped, but the caliber of players that they've been bringing in recently has been at extremely high level, guys who've been able to come in and contribute pretty quickly as true freshmen. I think you'll kind of be able to see a continuation of that trend and perhaps even, a further uptick with that just because, Coach Jackson is a very well-renowned recruiter. Had so much success here at UNC, was instrumental to putting together that class in 2016 that included Austin Bergner, Michael Bush, Tyler Baum, the nucleus of that 2018 Omaha team and really strong 2019 club that made the supers. So I think that, Coach Jackson is going to be huge for this team going forward. And obviously, I think when you bring in a guy like that, it also takes some loads off other guys' plate. We saw last year how, Coach Howell and Coach Gaines working together a little bit more on the pitching side, the dividends that paid. And I think you can kind of see continuation of that even this year.
Yeah, and also speaks to Coach Forbes. He brings in, yes, it's a friend, but he's bringing in another head coach. It is about winning. It is about putting the best product on the field for North Carolina. It's not about ego. If it were about ego, that move does not happen. And it just, you see how it works. Scott Jackson joining, and it gives them, Forbes has talked about 2 with hitters and position players and 2 with the pitchers and all. Grace, your final thoughts here on this 2025 preview. Season's supposed to start Friday. We'll see. Valentine's Day. Weather is nasty in North Carolina right now, but we'll see how that shakes out. But final thoughts from you on this.
Well, I do also want to say about the Scott Jackson thing. I think that's a great idea overall. And we talk about Coach Forbes all the time, but he truly is, I think, with the players that he brings in and the culture that he has in that clubhouse, he truly is not just interested in bringing the best product on the field, but having the best people around him to make his team better people and better humans in general. And which I think is so important. The amount of them that are actually going to go on to play professional baseball is quite low. But he's making sure that they're better humans out in society as well. And so I think kudos to Scott Forbes for that. And I think this team has a lot of question marks, but I also think their upside is really high. They have great potential. They have the potential to have one of the best staffs in the ACC, if not the country. And I think some of The offense isn't going to be as explosive. I don't think we're going to have another record-breaking 115 home runs, but I think that they're going to be scrappy and they're going to play more maybe of an old school style of baseball, and it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a really fun team. I think it's going to be a really fun season. Their non-conference is strong. I'm really excited to see Texas Tech come in, hopefully, weather permitting, however many games we get out of that. The ECU series is going to be super fun. One of those games is going to be played at the DBAP, which is always really interesting. And then their ACC series is not a walk in the park. You and I mentioned this after Media Day, Tommy, but I think one of the biggest series that some people are overlooking, one of the biggest opponents because they're not ranked, is Stanford. Stanford is like mind-blowingly good to me, and I don't know why more people aren't talking about that. I'm like so excited to see Billy Rochko and Matt Scott pitch, and then like Rintaro Sasaki, who came from Japan. Like, hello? And then they're going to get to see Jamie Arnold at Florida State. And I don't know if you've seen any of like all of the D1 rankings that are coming out right now for the positions, but the ACC has the number one in every single category minus first baseman. They have some of the best catchers, and Luke is number 3 on the list. Jacob Ferentz for Virginia is number 1. Merrick Houston at shortstop. And then you have Drew Burris in the outfield. And you just have, they're not playing GT, but you have so many good players that they're either going to meet in conference play or the ACC tournament, that this is a really tough conference. And they don't have like a walk in the park schedule. And so they're going to have to play their best, like Coach says, all 27 outs for every single game of the season. And it's just going to be a treat to watch.
Yeah, the schedule goes from leaving the state twice, getting on a plane once last year, I believe, to they're all over the place this year. You mentioned that Stanford series, first weekend in March. It's in Chapel Hill, so that'll be worth checking out, especially if you want to see teams you don't normally get to see in Stanford. Kansas State comes. I mean, just a loaded schedule for the ACC. Pat, final thoughts? I started it this way. I'm going to end it this way. 6th in the preseason? I'll ask you this way. What has to happen for North Carolina to get that 6th or better national seed come June, I guess, late May?
Yeah, I think, in a lot of ways it does come down to the pitching staff, that it does reach this ceiling that we've kind of laid out, which is, again, extremely high. The other big factor will be just kind of like, how do the newcomers adapt? How does Tyson Bass look like the player who we saw in the fall, routinely posting 110 mile per hour exit velos, showing high speed as well. And, Rom Kellis, like we mentioned, what are kind of those next steps for Luke Stevenson, Gavin Gallagher? Can they be, 2 figureheads of a lineup? I think of those things all together, we're talking about a team that is very much Omaha capable. I will say, as we're kind of having this conversation, like you started off the conversation, like, why is UNC number 6 in the preseason? I think the big thing that it's easy to look at, these big holes, these big question marks, losing Vance Honeycutt. But as we're kind of going around and highlighting these different players at different positions, I don't think there's ever a time where you'll be like, ooh, UNC's really in trouble at that spot or anything along those lines. And I think that that's why you have UNC in this position right here, is that, there really is no glaring weakness. Sure, there can be questions about, the power potential of this club, but I think it's very possible that you could see this club. There's so many ranges of outcomes in terms of what this team is offensively. I agree with Grace that if you were to maybe pick today, I would say this is kind of more of a station-to-station team. But I remember going back to the fall, I said that after my first look at them, I came back 4 or 5 days later, and I think they hit 5 or 6 home runs in that scrimmage. And so I do think that, depending on how these first 2 weekends go, if UNC only hits 1 home run across those 2 weekends, I don't think everybody should be, ready to burn things down because the offense isn't going to be nearly as potent as last year. I think that could kind of come and go a little bit, ebb and flow, depending on the competition, depending on guys kind of getting their feet wet a little bit. And I'm really intrigued to see kind of how that eventually shakes out. Like, is this more of a kind of, high speed, moving guys over sort of offense, or is it kind of as powerful as it could be?
It's going to be fun to watch. And it starts Friday, but yeah, it's a long season. State, Wake, and Duke come to Boshomer Stadium. That's going to be crazy. Those series are always nuts. I mean, we know how State and Carolina match up. Grace Nugent, Pat James, D1 Baseball, Inside Carolina, preview of the 2025 baseball season. Shout out to those two that helped me get through this. Shout out to Johnny T-Shirt and Congruity, and shout out to everybody paying attention on the Inside Carolina message boards. We'll talk to you soon.